Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Asher Marketing Podcast. I'm Anthony Giuliano, and our guest tonight has the most difficult name of anyone I've had on the podcast, so I'm going to try to pronounce it correctly, and then inevitably he will correct me. Helge Hinniger?
That's pretty close. I go by Helge just because I don't know why. I had to pick something, so that's what I picked.
All right. Well, Helge, thanks for being generous there that I got it wrong, even though you repeated it a few times before we started recording.
It's all good.
Well, thanks for being with us. You are the dad of 5 kids.
I am indeed, yes. Every man has to have one expensive hobby, and they'd be mine.
I only have one. So how do you balance that with work and everything else? How do you keep everyone happy? And the answer is probably that you don't keep everyone happy, but how do you keep it all together?
You might be onto something. I think having a patient wife definitely helps with all of that. And trying to maintain some semblance of work-life balance, but it's probably tipped more towards work than life for longer than I'd care to admit.
Sure. I think that's true of most people. Well, you have a really fascinating story, so I want to get right to it. As we've discussed, on this podcast, we talk about career paths. We talk about the organization you work for. We talk about some of the projects you're working on. And you are not a U.S. native. So I want to hear a little bit about that. How did you make your way from Germany to the U.S. and what have you been doing ever since?
Yeah. So I grew up in Berlin, Germany, West Berlin, back in the day because the city was still divided. Relatively early on in my life, while I was going to college in Hamburg, ran into a Fort Wayne native. And she sort of swept me off my feet and became my patient wife. So,
okay. All right.
We've been back and forth a number of different times. We're still both in college when we met. So I spent a year going to PFW, and then we moved back to Germany. And that's when I first headed into kind of the world of advertising. While I was going to college, I thought I was going to be a journalist. Okay. And I think a surprising number of marketing people kind of take that track. I'm going to start dating myself a whole lot real early, but this was when that Pan Am flight got bombed out of the sky over Lockerbie, and another intern just kind of walked into my office crying because they just decided that she was going to have to call the relatives of those people that had just died and ask them for their reaction. Wow. And that was the first time I asked myself whether I really wanted to do this for a living or not. I mean, This was for a tabloid, so there probably would have been some other options, but ended up interning at an ad agency as a copywriter, and the creative director, this was Darcy Mazius, Benton and Bowles in Hamburg, so pretty big international shop. And the creative director there, when I left, told me that if I ever wanted a job to come look him up, and I was brazen enough to do that and started working there.
Okay. All right. So you came into this world as a writer, and you're obviously bilingual. You speak very fluent and better English than most of the native English speakers I've met. So you have written creatively in both languages. Is that true? What challenges does that present?
Well, I mean, the biggest stuff that trips you up are kind of the idioms. So when when we moved to the States the first time around, this was after a couple of 2.5 years in the writing world, and I moved to Fort Wayne. I thought, well, my writing life is obviously over, because who's going to be crazy enough to hire somebody, a foreigner, to do their copywriting for them when there's all kinds of perfectly good Americans running around. So my first job here in Fort Wayne was actually at Instant Copy. I don't know if you were around Fort Wayne.
I do remember the name.
Was a thing.
Yep.
So, right here downtown, and worked in pre-press because I'd played enough. So when I first started writing, like, my tools of the trade were a pad of paper and a pencil. And
was that on Van Buren Street, just north of Journal Gazette, or do I have that wrong?
No, Ferguson was right across from the courthouse on 803 South Calhoun Street.
Got it. Okay.
Still know their phone number by heart, too. I'm sorry. The Instant Copy, that was right where, basically, where the fancy steak places, the name of which I can't think of right now, Chris.
Okay. All right. Okay.
The steak place with a tongue twister built in.
Yeah, with a possessive for no reason.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's a story behind that, but that's another podcast with another person, I think. So anyways, I worked there in pre-press for about a year, and this was back before agencies had color printers, and the Ferguson folks would come down there and just, print out layouts, and started a conversation with them. And, you get to know people, and they told me that they were about to lose a copywriter that was starting his own music business. So I put my book together and applied because I figured I didn't have anything to lose. And they were nice enough to hire me. And so you asked about the things that trip you up. I was known for some Helgeisms early on. When you write stuff and you kind of think you know what you're doing, and then somebody says, well, that's not really, I think, what you're trying to say there. Rich Ferguson, so I worked, back in the Rich Ferguson and Nancy Wright running the place days. And Rich was a very patient, kind mentor with a good sense of humor. So, that the ones that tripped me up, he usually caught and kind of helped me along the way. But, I was young enough then that I was still learning how to write anyway. So part of it was just language thing, and part of it was just, learning how to copyright.
Sure. So going back a step, when was it that you first moved to the U.S.?
That would have been in 94.
Okay, so 94.
Yes.
So that's actually when I first moved to Indiana. It was 94 from Massachusetts. What were your first impressions of Indiana, of the U.S., of everything you were confronted with, if you will?
Yeah. So I actually, the first time I came to Indiana was in the winter, a couple of years prior. So obviously I thought it was brown and cold.
Yeah, kind of like it is today on April 20th when we have snow and brown and cold. Yeah.
Well, the grass is green under the snow, so we've got that going for us. So I thought that, and I mean, when you grow up in Europe, and especially in West Berlin, where you were around a lot of Americans, because I lived in the American sector, so I grew up with Hueys flying overhead and American military vehicles going down the main street from time to time. And you watch TV shows about the States, and it's not like I grew up dreaming of moving to the States, but I was definitely intrigued. You are exposed to an awful lot of American culture growing up in Europe. So to me, it was just I came here kind of with a sense of wonder and exploration, maybe. And I mean, I also came here to, hang out with my girlfriend. So there was that.
Sure. So you're at going back to where we left off. You went to Ferguson, and you were there for quite some time, correct?
Yep. Yeah, I was at Ferguson for, I think, 7 years altogether. I left for a little while to work at Vorderman Volkswagen. Vorderman was one of our clients at the time, and I was kind of in a phase where, I kind of tipped into copywriting and marketing communications by accident, right? I mean, I had this internship, I had this opportunity, I took it. And I kind of fell in love with Vorderman. This was just when they were moving from their little place on Lay Road to the big dealership that they're still in today, and started moonlighting there just because I like cars.
Yep.
And worked on Saturdays a little bit, and then they asked me if I wanted to come sell cars for them. I'm like, sure, I'll try it. It was a good way, because it was just a good way to explore whether something else would be better for me. And the first deliberate sort of career move that I made turned out was not really for me. I enjoyed it for a year, and then I started missing creative work. I also started missing having Saturdays off.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I don't know if you've experienced this with your older children, and I've experienced it recently I only have one child. My son is 21. And he is doing a little hand wringing about career choice. And I said, welcome to the rest of your life. You will have that thought from time to time, even if you're fulfilled in your work. Yep. And so I think all of us have, a sense that the grass may be greener somewhere else. We want to explore careers. And sometimes you do that and you find out the career you were in was the right career for you, but you do that through trial and error. Yeah.
But, it's also, I think, fun to just go try new stuff.
Sure.
I mean, after that year or year and a half at Vorderman, when I figured out that I didn't really want to do this anymore, actually, as one of those aha moments, I lived on 3 acres back then. I was mowing the yard, and I was halfway through mowing the yard and thinking about the fact that actually I was on vacation from Vorderman for the first time. I'm like, oh, this is really nice. I get to see my kids. And I'm like, what am I doing? So I shut the mower off. I went inside to see my wife and I said, would you mind if I started looking for a job in advertising again? Because I don't really want to do this car sales thing anymore. And she looked at me and said, I was wondering when you're going to figure that out.
And you ended up back at Ferguson.
Yeah.
So how did that, was it just sheer luck that there was a position open, or how did that work?
I think there was definitely some luck involved. And I called Nancy, and I don't know that they had necessarily a full-time writing position open, but I'm also I'm not a designer, even though I worked as kind of one for a while in Germany. That was pretty stressful. But I'm a pretty decent production artist. This was when the internet was first starting, so I could dabble in that a little bit. And I think they liked me well enough that they were able to patch together enough job descriptions that they had enough stuff to keep me busy and make them money. So
got it. Yeah, you can be a pretty good utility player in this world if you have the right skills. We've got a couple of those on our team who are sort of invaluable because they can do multiple things and we can shift the workload as needed. So if I remember correctly from looking at your LinkedIn profile, it was Ferguson. Was there another job between Ferguson and Fort Wayne Metals? Do I have that right?
Yes, that job was in Germany.
Okay.
Yeah. So we decided at some point in our lives that it might be time to go back to Germany for a variety of reasons, but the most important one was I really wanted my kids to experience what it was like to grow up in Germany. Because, life here, I wouldn't say it's radically different, but there are a lot of nuances. Like, I never rode in a school bus in my life. My kids reassure me that I didn't really miss anything. But, you know, in Germany, you walk to elementary school by yourself. Yeah. That's pretty unthinkable in Fort Wayne. I think a lot of people get hives just thinking about allowing their kids to walk to school.
Sure.
So I wanted them to, or we wanted them to have this experience. So we decided to move to Germany, and again, through sheer luck and some connections from my agency's days at Darcy, I got a job at a regional public transport authority as I think it was a graphics editor, and I thought it was going to be heavier on the editor part. It was pretty heavy on the graphics part.
Okay.
So here I was, a decent production artist trying to pretend to be a designer.
Sure.
And I mean, I was the best designer they had there because I was the only one. But it was outside of my comfort zone. It definitely stretched me. It made me an even better production artist.
Sure. So how long were you back in Germany?
7 years.
7 years. Okay. Yep. Well, I applaud you for doing that, because one of the things, this might be a slightly controversial statement, but I think we in the U.S. can believe that the entire world is like it is here. And to see another part of the world, I think that's a really great experience for a number of reasons for your kids to have.
Yeah. Just a little side story here, but when we moved to Germany, I went to IKEA with my oldest son, who was at the time, maybe call it 8. Mm-hmm. And, when you go through IKEA at the end, they have, the food stands, and they had a big sign up that said, hot dogs without pork. And he said, "Is that for Muslims?" Mm-hmm. And I said, "Yeah," because he grew up. He went to school with a number of Turkish kids, which is pretty normal in Germany. And he looked at me and was like, "Isn't it funny how in America everybody's Christian?" I'm like, "I'm glad I brought you here." I also question the way that I brought you up in the U.S. because obviously that statement's far from true. But
sure. Well, it's good to challenge some of those preconceptions.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. So you're in Germany for 7 years. You come back to the U.S. How do you land at Fort Wayne Metals?
I got lucky again. So Fort Wayne Metals has been a client of Ferguson Advertising's for a long time, and I did some writing for them. I kind of struck up a not quite friendship, but a friendly acquaintance with their chief commercial officer, Bob Myers. Wonderful, wonderful gentleman. I've worked for a lot of amazing people. So Bob knew that I went to Germany and found out pretty quickly after we left the States that I moved to a town not too far from Düsseldorf, and that's there's a big medical trade show. Okay. And he kind of kept in touch. Every time he was in Dusseldorf, we'd get together for a
Yep.
glass of wine or dinner, and he introduced me to some other Fort Wayne Metals people. And when we decided to come back, it was just right smack in the doldrums of the Depression or recession. I guess it wasn't.
Yeah, it was
wasn't
close.
really
It was
quite
close to a
right.
depression. Yeah.
Felt kind of depressing. And I reached out to a number of different people, including John Ferguson. And he mentioned to Bob that, actually I reached out to Bob too, but I think my email got caught in spam, so that was strange. So John made Bob aware of the fact that I was thinking about coming back. And I think Bob was at a point where, I mean, he was handling the marketing communications for all of Fort Wayne Metals, which had grown at that point to about 550-ish people selling internationally, going to trade shows in multiple different countries. And I think Bob saw the opportunity to hire somebody that could take that off of his hands. So I got an email out of the blue saying, let's talk.
Okay.
While he was in Germany.
So your position was a new position in effect.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And now I'm going to transition to talk a little bit about Fort Wayne Metals, because I think most people in Fort Wayne know the name, but the rest is kind of a mystery. I mean, you and I talked before we hit record, but my knowledge is very limited. I believe there's a plant in Ireland, and the only reason I know that is because I know Scott Glaze started J.K. O'Donnell's and was inspired by some things he saw in Ireland and brought some pieces back from Ireland, but that's probably the limit of what I know. So tell us a little bit about Fort Wayne Metals.
So let's start with Fort Wayne Metals, and then we'll talk about Ireland, and then we'll talk about JKs. There's a whole lot of stuff to untangle here. So Fort Wayne Metals, basically we make wire, which sounds pretty unspectacular until you learn that I would say probably a good 90% of our wire goes into the human body either temporarily or permanently. So, our customers use our wire to make pacemaker leads. They use our wire to make stents, guide wire. So when you have minimally invasive surgery and they put a stent in your heart, they need something to guide the instrument from your groin where they stick the wire into your vasculature to the heart. We make wire that goes into people's brains. So it is highly precise. None of what we do is commodity wire. We don't have any shelves of material just sitting around waiting for customers to call and say, ask if we have a certain size. So everything we make is made to order. It's high quality. It is tested rigorously because it's
probably very rigorous from a regulatory standpoint because it's going in the human body.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then, we do some stuff for non-medical applications too. But the vast majority of what we do, it goes into medical. So anything where the performance of the wire is important and basically, you can't afford to fail, that's kind of where we play. One of the materials that I think is super cool that we make is nitinol, which is a nickel titanium alloy that has shape memory. So you can set it to a certain shape. And if it's cold, you can stretch it out and heat it back up. It returns automatically to its own shape. Huh. So there's some really cool stuff. Yeah, the preconceptions, I think a lot of people think that we make big steel girders or we recycle scrap metal or stuff like that. None of that's true. Okay. The smallest wires we make right now are probably, I want to say, 1/10 the diameter of a human hair.
Wow.
So it's really a lot of really tiny stuff.
And was it founded by Scott back in the 80s? Do I have any of that right?
It was founded by Scott's dad, Ardell, in the 70s.
Okay,
71.
so I was wrong on both accounts, but not.
Well, you have the last name right that you didn't mention.
Good. So I got one thing right. Yeah. And was it originally founded with the same application in mind, or was it a different animal at that time?
I think it was founded mostly on precision. So, Fort Wayne has been a wire town for a really long time. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of magnet wire stuff and going on in town. Actually, what our first claim to fame was that really hit it big was recording wire. Okay. So before there was magnetic tape or, Zoom recorders and stuff like that, sound was recorded on just wire, and it's still used, I think, in some black boxes and planes because it's resilient. Obviously, disruptive technology came around. The recording tape kind of destroyed that market pretty well overnight, and Ardell had to figure out what was next. Okay. And that was, I think, this was also during the time when medical device companies in the region kind of started kicking up, and we formed some relationships with them. And it was one of those things where, once you once they heard, at least, I don't know if that still works like that. I think it still works like that today. But when a company hears that you're kind of good at something, they tend to push you in a certain direction.
Sure.
Because if they have a vendor that they know can't quite do this yet, but they trust that they will be able to, they will.
They'd rather push someone they know than work with someone they don't
exactly.
know.
Yep.
Yeah. So you're headquartered in Fort Wayne.
Yes.
Plants where around the world?
So we're headquartered in Fort Wayne. Most of our plants are here. We have one facility in Columbia City where we actually melt nitinol. We've got some vacuum furnaces there that allow us to do precision melting. We also have now 2 plants in Castlebar, Ireland, and we put those there to be closer to our European customers.
Sure. Okay. All right. So let's talk about your work then. How do you fit into this big picture?
Yep.
Who do you market to? How do you market to them? And what does everyone always says, there is no average day, but what are you typically working on the average day?
So we market to engineers more than anything else.
Okay.
Those are the people that look to our materials to solve their problems. And I really lead a small in-house creative team. There's a couple of writers other than me, and I don't really write all that much anymore except for emails. We have a designer, multimedia design specialist, and a project manager. And we handle the vast majority of the creative that we also use. We have a couple of other companies that we help out. We also handle the strategic internal communications. So to your point, there is really no typical day.
Sure.
But, we try to keep up with the demands of Fort Wayne Metals. We try to make sure that we look good, that our materials are easily understood in multiple languages, that our employees know what's going on, that we, take a look at new channels, both internally and externally. I definitely try to put most of my focus on marketing communications, but internal communications, I'd liken it to a wood chipper. Once you get your fingers in it, you just, it never lets go and you don't feel quite right coming out the other side.
That's an interesting analogy that I've never heard before. I may borrow that sometime.
That's fine.
So in terms of the big projects you're working on, there's something that we were discussing before we hit record that's really fascinating to me, and I'd love to learn more about it. Yep. I believe you said it's called the James Project.
Yes.
Now, for our listeners, we're going to go down a little bit of a path here. You can explain it better than I am, but it's not Fort Wayne Metals' core business, but it's a passion project related to the business. Yeah. So with that, if you can take it and run with it.
Yep. And I mean, I must preface this by saying that my day-to-day involvement in the James Project is pretty limited. This is very much a Fort Wayne Metals initiative, not a Fort Wayne Metals Communications Department initiative. And the story I want to take you back to is Scott Glaze's dad. So Scott is the chairman and CEO of Fort Wayne Metals. His dad founded Fort Wayne Metals. And the interesting part about Ardell's story is that I think he could have very easily taken a completely different path, and there's probably a multitude of alternate universes in which Fort Wayne Metals doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. And that's because he grew up in the Great Depression. His home life was difficult. I don't know that his dad was in the picture a great deal. And he was kind of running the streets, trying to, make ends meet. And there was a bakery, and the bakery had a coal chute. And he was running around with a gang of boys. And since he was kind of the skinniest, scrappiest one of them all, they'd lower him down the coal chute. He'd go down there. He'd get into the pecan storage, stuff his pockets with pecans. They'd pull him back up, and he'd pass out the pecans. Well, the baker, whose name is Mr. James, hence the name, the James Project, noticed that there were pecans missing, and also noticed that there was a gang of boys hanging around, put 2 to 2 together, and confronted him and said, "Hey, somebody's been stealing my pecans. Who was it?" And Ardell stepped forward and said, "It was me." And Mr. James said, "Well, you're going to have to work off your debt." Mm-hmm. And took this kid in, gave him basically a job to work off his debt, and he kept the job afterwards, and kind of took him under his wing as his surrogate father, and kind of put him on the path to, having a work life and having ambitions and seeing his potential, and helped turn him into the person that ultimately started Fort Wayne Metals, and that ultimately started a company that now employs 1,200 people. And the James Project, I think, is Scott's way of paying that forward a little bit. So he bought the old Mr. Wiggs building on Hannah Street that I think had been a church and just kind of been sitting empty for a while, refurbished it completely, and turned it into a manufacturing facility with the purpose of making work available to and making opportunities available to Fort Wayne Southeast side. So, this is a demographic that we've been trying to attract for a little while. And there are just so many roadblocks for them to come to work for Fort Wayne Metals. We have a pretty rigorous testing system to screen applicants that if you haven't had, a great high school education, you might not be able to pass. We're by the airport, no bus runs there. So if you don't have a car, you're not going to be able to come work for us. The James Building is by a bus stop on Hannah Street. We will hire people there without the screening and basically train them on the job until they can pass the test and then go on to become, a wire drawer or, basically to fulfill any function at Fort Wayne Metals. So it's really a way to give people a leg up.
Sure.
And allow. I think it's kind of Scott's way of trying to do for other people what Mr. James did for his dad.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating, and it's what's interesting. One of the many things that's interesting to me about Fort Wayne Metals is it's not one business. There have been other enterprises that are part of the umbrella organization, if you will. You mentioned J.K. O'Donnell's, and that's one of the things that I learned over the years is that Scott Glaze actually started J.K. O'Donnell's. There was also at one point, I think there was, I don't know if it still exists, a fish farm that was involved. So
we did.
What are some of the other enterprises that are current or that have been part of the business?
So J.K.'s is another great story, I think, of Scott just doing something because it's the right thing. This was, you remember what Fort Wayne Metals Fort Wayne downtown was like. When I worked at Ferguson, the sidewalks got rolled up at about 5 p.m. and downtown was dead.
I tell my younger coworkers that when I started working at Asher in 2004, so not all that long ago, but my lunch choices were Coney Island, Double Dragon, Dash In, Loaf and Ladle, and that was about it.
Yeah.
And now you could go to a different place every day, and still in a month you wouldn't have hit every option you have. Very different environment at that time.
Yeah, when I first started working downtown, Dash In didn't exist.
Okay, all right.
So we had, I think, Coney Island, Cindy's, I think the Soda Fountain.
Okay.
Which, if you haven't been to the Soda Fountain, huge shout out to down in Lincoln Tower. If you like milkshakes, that's the place to be.
Oh, really? I pass it. I often walk to work from about a mile away, and I pass it, but I've never been in there, so I have to give it a shot.
You really need to.
That's the whole reason I do this podcast, is to learn great places to eat. No, so you mentioned, here's what I saw happen downtown is first the library was built, and I was like, oh, that's a cool building that didn't have to be a cool building. That's kind of nice. And then J.K. O'Donnell's was not too long after that, and I was like, oh, this, because I'll admit I was skeptical when I heard there's going to be an authentic Irish pub. I was like, what's it going to be, a Bennigan's? And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, I was wrong. This is really cool. Yeah.
And the reason Scott put that there, I think, is because he has always been a supporter of vibrant downtowns and the downtown improvement district. And it was just, I think, a case of Scott putting his money where his mouth is. Like, I don't know that he ever really felt the urge to run an Irish pub, but he wanted a destination downtown, and he wanted to prove to everybody that said it couldn't be done that it could damn well be done. And he's right. Turns out that it's been a good move. Yeah. So in addition, you've got the James Project under the Fort Wayne Metals wing. You've got the J.K. O'Donnell story. What are some of the things you're putting your time into that are time intensive, that are keeping you up at night, that excite you, or maybe a combination of those things? So the thing that probably excites me the most about Fort Wayne Metals marketing communications is that we spent over the last few years a fair amount of time. So when I first started there, it was just shoring up stuff, making sure that, our trade show booth looked right, and kind of redesigning things. And, I started all by myself. There was no team. And as we've grown our team and our bandwidth, we have been able to kind of take a step back and be more deliberate about how we approach our marketing communications. And over the last few years, we've developed a brand persona for ourselves, which is approachable innovator. We've always been innovators, but like if you look at our current website, it's very clinical and sterile, and that's not really who we are as a company. If you talk to anybody at Fort Wayne Metals, people are willing to have conversations. They're willing to listen. They are usually fairly humble. They are always excited to help. And I wanted our brand to reflect that. So we developed this approachable innovator persona, and we're just in the process of going through all of our marketing communications materials and infusing sort of that approachable innovator feel to everything that we do. And it's really cool. We thought about this for a really long time, and it's really cool to see that come together. Once you figure out what an approachable innovator sounds like, what an approachable innovator looks like when you turn him into a marketing handle. Yeah. So that's what we're working on right now. We're starting to kind of have the first pieces put together. Some of them are going to take longer, like the website, but that's super exciting. The other thing that's exciting to me is that we've been working with Salesforce for a while as our CRM, and we've recently added Pardot and are working on, building some marketing automation, completely different way of, or a completely different chunk of a sort of marketing communications to think about. So
is a communication plan that is automated, or is it more than that?
Well, it's whatever we want it to be, I guess.
Okay,
but
all right.
There are some opportunities where fundamentally what I want that to do is I want our customer service representatives to spend less time working on things that could be automated, so they can work on things where they bring value to our customers.
Sure.
And I think that will allow all of the work to kind of shift down a little bit, so everybody in sort of that value chain facing customers will have more time to do the work that's really helpful and I hope enjoyable.
Well, and it's a differentiator.
Yep.
Because, at some point, everyone's going to be deploying technology in the same way, and it's going to have less. Right now, it can be a competitive advantage, but the bigger competitive advantage is truly going to be your people and their ability to provide high levels of service and know the customer.
Yeah. And, if I don't think, well, actually, I know as long as I'm going to be around that Fort Wayne Metals is never going to turn into a place where you just talk to a computer. One of our strengths is the quality and the knowledge of our people. We have, people there that have been working for us for 30 years and that just have that wealth of knowledge about the materials that they work with, about the customers that we deal with. And I want to be able to, take a little bit of the grunt work and offload it off of them and allow them to flex that muscle more.
Yeah, well, and a lot of investments in people. I mentioned that before we started recording that I've been a little bit involved in the internship program, and you have a really great internship program, sort of a investment in people early on to help them develop, in some cases into great Fort Wayne Metals employees, but really preparing them well for whatever career path they choose to pursue.
Yep, and that's another passion I think of Mr. Glaze's is, one of the things that Fort Wayne Metals does is we provide, if you work full-time at Fort Wayne Metals and you want to go to school, Fort Wayne Metals will reimburse your tuition at the going PFW undergraduate rate. And we don't much care whether you get a degree to be a more effective Fort Wayne Metals employee or if you get your degree to do something completely different.
Yeah.
I remember the case of one employee that got a teaching degree and, when they were done, they left Fort Wayne Metals and Scott was completely fine with that because he believes in strengthening the community. It's not, he's not the kind of guy that just wants to grow the company and get stupid rich in the process. I think he really does have that passion to make Fort Wayne and this region a better place.
Sure. Well, that's very rare and that's great. And in itself, it's a way to attract new employees. So it kind of helps you out anyway, even if those folks aren't retained for an entire career.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about what I call the speed round of the show, where we
right.
go over some of the stuff we've talked about, but synthesize it a little bit. You've had a fascinating path, and have learned from folks who themselves have had a pretty great path. But if you could distill that down to some career advice, and this could be for someone who is aspiring to a career in marketing, someone at Fort Wayne Metals who's just getting started in their career, what's your best career advice?
Probably learn when to say no, but always tend towards saying yes.
Okay. All right.
I've done some stuff where I wasn't sure if I was going to succeed. And I think, if I think about my time in Germany, passing myself off as a designer, I was not a great success as a designer, but I've learned a bunch of stuff, and I am still glad that I did it. I'm still glad I went and sold cars. I have a whole new appreciation for salespeople, and I also now know that marketing is what I really want to do.
Yep.
So being open to learning, being open to opportunities, being curious about the world and everything that's going on around you, I think is really important.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about Fort Wayne Metals. And I won't ask you, the question I typically ask people is, if you had to describe, your organization succinctly, you do that all the time. So for you, it's too easy. So I'll give you a more difficult question. What do you think is the thing you'd most want people to know about Fort Wayne Metals that maybe they don't know, or maybe to clear up a misconception?
So the misconception, I think, is that we, that we work with big metal stuffs and it's smelly and hot and dirty, and Fort Wayne Metals is none of the above. All of our facilities are air conditioned. All of our facilities are clean. The stuff we make is much more often small than big. Like the biggest stuff now that we melt, I guess the biggest stuff that we make is like 12 inches diameter and weighs a couple of 1,000 pounds. But a lot more often, like I said, we make stuff that's the 10th of diameter of a human hair. My technical writer is going to yell at me because I'm sure I got that number wrong. But so that's a big misconception. The other misconception that I think that I always kind of bristle at is that manufacturing is meaningless button pushing work. We have a whole lot of really smart people that have to think on their feet, that have to keep an eye on quality, that make materials that can decide, over life and death if things go horribly wrong, and that I think have fulfilling, meaningful, well-paying jobs.
Yeah, and really a strength of our region. There's a lot of companies that are doing really fascinating, truly sort of world-changing work in our backyard, and not a lot of people know about them. And Fort Wayne Metals is probably at the top of that list.
Well, we're near the top of it.
Near the top of the list. Okay. Well, that's some great humility. Then the last question, I'm going to change this one up. I'm giving you some challenges. So, we've been through a global pandemic. We're still in it, but hopefully emerging out of it slowly but surely. What have you learned in the last year plus that you're going to take into the future and use? And what do you think other people could learn from what we've experienced?
I don't know. I'm guessing this has been said before by smarter people than me, but I think what I've learned is that if you look for it, there's always opportunity. The last year and a half have been really hard for, I think, all of us. But if you look at remote work, if you look at all the things that weren't possible, that all of a sudden became possible overnight. If you think about the way that people are thinking differently, I think there's just, if you look at things the right way and have maybe the right people to support you and help you along, you can, I'm not a big fan of the pull yourself up by your bootstraps analogy, because I think in a lot of cases that's just false. I think, if you're deep enough in the muck, it's going to be hard to do that. But if you approach a situation the right way, you can always find a kernel of something that will help you along.
Yeah. Well, I think the benefit of, and again, there's a lot of people who've had really dire circumstances over the last year, and I don't want to, diminish that at all. But for those of us who've been fortunate enough to come out of this with our health and everything else intact, we were operating on muscle memory. And then things sort of forced us to stop. And we learned how to adapt without all the benefits of how we used to work. We were forced to work in a different way. And now emerging out of it, we can go back to what was best about the way we used to work, but we're not beholden to that anymore.
Yes.
We've learned some new skills that hopefully can be complements to what we used to do and take the best of both those worlds and move forward in a way that I hope is going to spur on some innovation and already has. I mean, you and I mentioned this too, that this podcast wouldn't exist if not for the pandemic because it forced us to do something different.
Yep. Yeah, and thank you for that redirect there on. I mean, there are definitely people that have suffered in this pandemic in ways that will make it really hard to find that kernel of positivity.
Sure.
And I definitely didn't want to discount that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think again, it's one of those things where you have to sort of you have to respect the individualized experience and know that everybody's gone through this a little bit differently, but there are opportunities if you look for them. And that was true during the recession, as you learned from a job standpoint. That's true if you move to a different country. That's true if you change careers. And that's true even emerging out of everything we've been through the last year.
Yeah, fact.
Yeah. Well, it was very nice to meet you. You and I had not met, I don't think, in the real world.
No, I don't think so.
Tonight, although I knew you a little bit from the internet. So it's a pleasure talking to you, and I'd love to talk more in the future. And I hope everyone enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another great guest. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again in the real world sometime soon.